Bruno is going to translate simultaneously. So yeah, thank you very much, Don, to come again and again. Thank you so much. Like even this teaching is so precious. So we are going to not to be the commentaries on Heart Sutra, and yeah. So I think we like to start like having auspicious signs, and then if you can recite the mandala. If I can recite the mandala offerings for us to start the teachings.
Wonderful. That would be great. Thank you, Venerable Namdo.
So this is a way that we offer, the whole world, everything that you like for us to receive, for us to open our minds, to be ready to receive, to be open mind, to listen to these teachings. Sashipo ki Jushin meto Trari Dali Ni de Gen Paji Sange Jinde Mite Uai Jokuna Dajila Topasho Idan Guru Ratna Mandala Kaniyataya. You'd like me to do the refuge prayer now, or you'd like to say some words first?
Please go ahead and do the prayer, I think. Yeah, thanks.
So now you're going to do the refuge prayer for us, our motivation for these teachings. I'm going to say in English. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, in the Dharma, in the Supreme Assembly. By the merits of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dharma, in the Supreme Assembly. By my merits of listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigratory beings. Sangye chodam soki chonam la jantu bado dani kyapsuchi dagi choringi pe sonanki jola penche sangye dupasho.
Wonderful. Thank you, Venerable Namdo. So it's good to see you all again. Many of you I think I saw before when I taught for Shiwa La previously. So let's just set our motivation. We're not going to spend a lot of time in meditation, but at least spend a minute or two of silence and then generate a good motivation for being here. So just focus on the breath for the next minute or so, and just bring your awareness to the breath, however you choose to work with the breath. And when the mind wanders, then just gently guide the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes. So as we recited in the prayer that we just did, we want to ideally have this motivation that strives to become a Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings. And this is particularly important with regard to the sutra we're looking at tonight, the Heart Sutra. This is a sutra of the Mahayana tradition. It is a sutra that helps us to discover the wisdom that we need to achieve enlightenment, as well as implicit within it, hidden within it, are also the teachings about how we can traverse and travel the bodhisattva path, how we can go from our unenlightened state all the way to the state of Buddhahood. So we're receiving very precious instructions through this sutra. So we want to hold that motivation that seeks to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings, that seeks to use these teachings in our time together tonight to achieve our greatest potential, our own state of enlightenment, so we then can help others to do the same. So just try to cultivate this mind of bodhicitta very deeply right now, so that everything we do becomes a cause for that result. And then you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. So I'm glad to hear that you're reciting this sutra before your lam-rim study classes. The sutra itself is said to be very powerful in terms of removing obstacles, giving us kind of the teachings of wisdom that of course cut through all of our obstacles, all of our obscurations. So what I'm going to do over tonight and 2 weeks from tonight is to give you an introduction to the Heart Sutra, a little bit of commentary. I do want to advise you that there is a longer course on the Heart Sutra that is offered through the basic program of the FPMT, where you go into much greater detail and you use a more traditional commentary and you go through page by page and really examine the Heart Sutra in much more detail. But what I'll do for the time we have together is to give you at least some idea of what the sutra is about, the structure of the sutra, and hopefully you can then use that to increase your understanding, perhaps do some self-study. I imagine that there are some translated commentaries in Portuguese that you could use. There was one in particular that I often refer to, which is by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, his teachings on the Heart Sutra that he did in California in the US, I think back around 1999, somewhere in there. So anyway, just know that there are many other ways that you can also kind of engage in this sutra. So before we get into the actual sutra, I do want to talk about maybe like 3 what I call kind of preliminary topics, topics to give us the context in which the Heart Sutra is presented. And when I teach this in more detail in the basic program, I go into a number of other topics, but I'll abbreviate those, shorten those a little bit tonight. But the very first one is to relate it to the lam-rim and the teachings of the Buddha. So you want to be clear about where this fits into the lam-rim. There are some teachings that say that if you took everything that the Buddha taught and you were to summarize it into 2 main goals, the first goal would be what we call high status, which is essentially referring to an upper rebirth, a good rebirth. This is a topic I'm sure you're quite familiar with. The initial scope, the initial teachings of the lam-rim are for the person who is intent upon achieving a good rebirth, like the rebirth that we have right now, this perfect human rebirth. And so this is the first goal that the Buddha taught. It's an intermediate goal. It's not a final goal. It's much more temporary. But nonetheless, the Buddha gave very detailed teachings about how to acquire good status, high status. In fact, I'll be returning to teach all of you next month in the, well, some of you may not be coming to those teachings. It's the Discovering Buddhism course on karma. But certainly if you want to pursue the teachings on karma that are really instrumental in determining our good rebirth, our next rebirth, I'll be reviewing those at the end of September, the final weekend in September. So the teachings that are entailed in that goal of achieving high status are primarily karma. And again, you achieve a temporary goal, you get a good rebirth, but that state of goodness, that state of well-being, is not definite, right? Because we can deteriorate from that. We can fall from that perfect rebirth if we don't use that life meaningfully, if we don't pay attention to the law of karma. So the second result that the Buddha taught is frequently called definite goodness or certain goodness. And the idea is that when we attain that state, it is definite and certain that it will continue. It's a more ultimate goal. It's a more final goal. And of course, in the lam-rim, we know that this is the stages of the path that we call for the person of middling capacity, middle capacity, the person of great capacity. For the person of middling capacity, they are trying to achieve the state of liberation. For the person of great capacity, as we are all aspiring to be, we need to achieve the goal of Buddhahood. We strive to achieve that goal as we just meditated on. So for both of those goals, for those two ultimate goals that are considered definite goodness, we need more than just the teachings on karma. We need the teachings on emptiness. And we need to develop this wisdom that will cut through all of what is keeping us bound in samsara, as well as what is keeping us from achieving Buddhahood. So the teachings on emptiness that are encapsulated in the Heart Sutra are applicable to either the middle scope or the great scope, but they're primarily directed at the person who is practicing the great scope, the person with the greatest capacity, the person who strives to become a Buddha. As I said, these are part of the Mahayana Sutras. So it's important, again, that we take them in that context, even though you also need the same wisdom realizing emptiness to attain your own liberation, to attain the goal of the middle scope. So another topic besides that, in terms of looking at kind of how we could relate it to the goals that the Buddha taught and the lam-rim, is to also look at what are called the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma, or wheel turnings, they're sometimes called. In fact, we just celebrated on Monday the first wheel turning. This was an auspicious day in our Buddhist calendar when we commemorate the first teachings that the Buddha gave, the very first discourse. So the very first teachings were essentially the Four Noble Truths. In the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha set out what our current situation is, that we have the truth of dukkha, or dissatisfaction. That secondly, it has its true origins in terms of karma and delusions, causing us to experience that dukkha. That there can be a cessation of dukkha, can be a complete end to all of our dissatisfaction and suffering. And fourthly, that we have to practice the path, the true path that leads to that cessation. So essentially, in this very first teaching, the Buddha gave the kind of context for all of what he taught the rest of his 45 years of teaching. It kind of set the stage for everything that the Buddha would be teaching. But in those initial teachings, he did not go into emptiness so much. And in fact, he seemed to almost avoid, denying so much, because many people coming to the teachings were not ready for these more profound teachings on emptiness. So it said that sometime later on Massive Vulture's Mountain or Vulture's Peak, we're going to come to that in a moment later tonight, in this very auspicious place, the Buddha gave teachings of the second turning of the wheel. This is what's referred to as the teachings on the emptiness of inherent existence or intrinsic existence. And so essentially these teachings are often referred to as the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. They are said to be the kind of discourses that the Buddha gave that primarily were intended to expound on emptiness, but they also had within them, I mentioned this in the meditation tonight, that they also have within them the entire bodhisattva path. Kind of how does the bodhisattva progress in terms of practicing the path to Buddhahood? Remember, we talk about often how achieving enlightenment requires two branches. We often refer to these as like the two wings of a bird. For a bird to fly to its destination, it needs both wings. Without both, it cannot possibly fly. So there too, although we need the wisdom aspect that is primarily taught in these sutras, such as the Heart Sutra, we also need to know the method, the way to go there, the more conventional teachings that help us to actually achieve the goal of Buddhahood, kind of in conjunction with, together with our wisdom realizing emptiness. So we always have these two together, what we often call method and wisdom. Method and wisdom are the essential components that are there in the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And in fact, when we go through the Heart Sutra tonight and in the next class, I'll point out how the path to enlightenment, the progress of the Bodhisattva is implicit. It is underneath the surface of the teachings of the Heart Sutra that are primarily, again, about emptiness. So this second turning of the wheel of Dharma was intended for people who have that disposition to be able to look at reality a little more deeply, to investigate the nature of things with more insight. And so they were the disciples who were ready for that level of what's called the middle way, the Madhyamika school. The third turning of the wheel of Dharma is actually said to have started when one disciple asked the Buddha, he said, well, in the first turning of the wheel, you were kind of adhering to things to exist in a somewhat more concrete way. In the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, you said nothing exists inherently. Well, which one is it? And this is kind of one of the interesting things about the Buddha. The Buddha taught so many different things over his 45 years. He had different disciples and different gatherings. And so he would give teachings in accord with who was in the audience, what they needed, the teachings that would help them on their path. So again, not everyone was ready for the second wheel turning. So in the third wheel turning, the Buddha actually said, oh, some things do inherently exist, but some things don't. And that one is called the wheel turning of fine discrimination, because the Buddha was discriminating between these two things. But actually, this is said to be a more provisional teaching. Again, for those people who maybe heard the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Prajnaparamita and the second wheel turning, but they weren't quite ready for how profound those teachings are on emptiness. So essentially, these three wheel turnings talk about different kind of stages of the Buddha's teaching. We can talk about them being somewhat chronological in that they all began with the first wheel turning, but there also were periods where the Buddha would return to the teachings of the first wheel turning and then of course add in the second wheel turning and so on. So there's no fixed period of time that these apply to, but rather, again, different sutras that reinforced each of these three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. So again, why I'm putting that out there is just so we know the context of these. These teachings were said to be definitive compared to the first wheel turning and the third wheel turning that are provisional. As I mentioned with the third wheel turning in particular, that's provisional because it's again setting out some teachings that are not in line with the final word of the Buddha. This whole idea of things being somewhat up to our own investigation is a part of the Buddha's teachings as well. It's the science of what's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics means the investigation of what needs to be interpreted versus what is more definitive. And even with the Buddha's teachings, this is something that's been going on since they first arrived in our world, and particularly in written format, where people started debating them and trying to discern what is the exact meaning, particularly with regard to this second wheel turning, the meaning of emptiness. And in fact, even in the middle way school, there are different tenet systems. One that doesn't go quite as far as what we do in this final word of the Buddha. I sometimes, when I introduce the Heart Sutra, talk about the tenet systems, but I'm going to set that aside because it's a rather complicated topic. There's an entire course again in the basic program as well that deals with what are called the tenets or the philosophical systems that the Buddha taught. Because he taught basically 4 different systems. And this is after the Buddha had passed, and they looked back on what he taught throughout those 3 turnings of the wheel. And they discerned that there were 4 main points of view that the Buddha taught that were practiced by different people. And so again, the highest point of view is said to be the middle way, the Madhyamika, the view that is presented in the Heart Sutra. And so I'm not going to look so much at the other ones, but just point out that that is kind of the conclusion that we are meant to come to through our own investigation, looking at these teachings on emptiness. Because the Buddha did give different teachings at different times. some of which can be relied upon as kind of stepping stones. The idea being that not everybody is ready to swim in the deep end of the pool. Some people need to go to the baby pool, kiddie pool, and they need to swim in very shallow waters. And then eventually they can go to the deep water. But initially they're not ready for that. So this is the idea behind these teachings, is that they are very profound. They are definitely in that final category that the Buddha taught, and therefore we have to have some understanding that we're going to be investigating a very profound view of emptiness, which is the view of emptiness that is taught in the lam-rim, the final view of emptiness, emptiness of inherent existence. The last topic that I want to touch on, besides the again the putting it in the context of the lam-rim and the high status and definite goodness. Secondly, looking at how it fits in terms of the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma, is lastly to just talk briefly about the idea of selflessness or emptiness. As I said, there are different views of that, but when it gets to this final view of the middle way, they often divide it into two categories. And I'm just bringing them up now because it will come up as I explain the Heart Sutra. The very first one is said to be selflessness or emptiness of persons. By persons, we mainly mean, first of all, the I, the capital I, this strong sense of personhood that we have here together with this mind and body. But we can also use that to refer to a selflessness of persons for other people, because we can do the similar investigation with regard to other people. Then we have what's called the selflessness of phenomena. By phenomena, we mean everything other than a person. Phenomena generally includes everything that exists, but when we talk about it in terms of selflessness, we mean selflessness of persons, meaning myself and other people, and then selflessness of other phenomena, which would include things like the body or the mind or a computer or a table, a chair, whatever phenomena we look at that is not a person. So why these are set out as somewhat separate is because as you go through those tenet systems, you actually find that some of the lower tenet systems, again, if you do get the opportunity to study tenets, you see that they don't investigate phenomena other than the person. And the Buddha did start with just us looking at this person, this self, this I, and trying to discern the nature of that first. So in those three turnings of the wheel of Dharma, the Buddha did teach some very coarse ways of examining this person, this self. And eventually it got subtler and subtler until we get to this middle way point of view. Now, for this middle way school that we are looking at, we can't say that those two selflessnesses are differentiated in terms of what is being negated, because for both of them, it's inherent or intrinsic existence. We'll look at this maybe next time more than tonight. That's the object of negation. That is what it is that we are falsely holding to with regard to the I and with regard to all other phenomena. So essentially, that's not different. If I'm talking about the selflessness or the emptiness of me, I, versus the selflessness or emptiness of a computer, it's the same thing that's being negated. The inherent existence, the independent existence, the objective existence. Again, different ways that this can be described. But essentially, the difference then is what object I'm using. Am I using the person to investigate emptiness, or am I using some other phenomenon? Because we see that there are some techniques that are more appropriate for investigating the person versus investigating other things in our world. So again, we'll look at this maybe a little bit next time that we get together. But I do want to point out that differentiation, because even in the sutra, there is one place where it kind of indicates that Avalokiteshvara, who is the main person reciting the sutra, that he actually has already realized the selflessness of the I, the person, and is then going on to realize the selflessness of phenomena. So I just wanted to point that out because it will come up tonight. So just know that, again, there's these preliminary topics that help us to get a context for what we're looking at. This Heart Sutra that was taught as part of the second wheel turning, that contains the most profound teachings on emptiness, the middle way point of view. And that, again, this is, something that we need to investigate for ourselves and so on, that we can see that this plays a key role in our progress on the lam-rim, to be able to discern emptiness at this level. Now, one thing I might mention before we get into this, because some of you may even find that your own investigation into emptiness is very difficult, frustrating maybe sometimes. Just understand that even just to have some doubt about how things exist, this is already very powerful. That's why reading the Heart Sutra can be really useful to kind of plant the seeds in our minds so that we can eventually realize this profound topic. Just to begin to question the nature of reality. There's a quote from Arya Deva. He says, "Those with little merit do not even doubt this teaching. Entertaining just a doubt tears to tatters worldly existence," kind of begins the process of destroying samsara, destroying our unenlightened existence. So just know that even if you're just gaining some imprints and beginning to doubt the nature of things, that's already enough to kind of move in that direction. Okay, so let me put on the screen a copy of the sutra that was very kindly translated into, I've got to close a file there. 1 second. Let me do that first, because I've got a file open here that I don't need to show that I was working on before the class tonight. Let me put up the one that I want to show you. Okay, it's there now. Okay, share this. Great, there it is. Okay. So again, this was kindly translated in this format. And this is something I'm going to be referring to frequently because this gives the structure for this sutra. And you'll see, let's just go over it briefly. You'll see that there's a prologue that is kind of having two parts to it, the common prologue and the uncommon prologue. Then we have the sort of actual sutra, kind of the body of the sutra, which we see is primarily divided into two main parts. One is how Shariputra, asked his question to Avalokiteshvara, and then how Avalokiteshvara responded. So again, we didn't read the sutra tonight before we began. I thought about doing that, but it takes a little while to recite it and we don't have so much time. Maybe we'll recite it at the very end of the next class. And that way, after we've gone through all of this, we can go through it together. And then you'll see that there's just a final little bit that's a conclusion to the sutra, which is essentially how what was said is admired by the Buddha. The Buddha kind of saying, this is very good that what you said, and so on. Again, most of you familiar with this because of your own recitation of it. So let's go back up to the top and let's look at the name of this sutra. It's called Arya Bhagavati Prajnaparamita Hridaya Sutra. Okay, so this is the title of this sutra in the Sanskrit. Again, the Sanskrit is said to be the language of the Buddhas. So it's very auspicious to actually even recite the name in Sanskrit, as well as it kind of provides imprints on our minds so that we can connect with the Buddhas and their teachings in the future. I just want to give a real brief explanation. There's more detail on this that you might find in other books of each of these words that are in here. The first one, Arya Bhagavati. This is essentially referring to kind of a female Bhagawan. You might hear the word Bhagawan on occasion, which is essentially referring to those beings who have attained the complete kind of cessation of all of what obscures the mind, the Buddhas. And so it's a female version of it, though, Bhagavati, because wisdom is very much tied to the feminine in Buddhism. Whereas the method side, remember those two wings of a bird, the method side is frequently tied to masculine, male energy. So this is kind of making a statement about this being the kind of sacred mother, the realization of emptiness in the mind of a Buddha, the fully realized mind of a Buddha that is encapsulated in that term Arya Bhagavati. The next word, of course, Prajnaparamita, is referring to the perfection of wisdom. Prajna is wisdom, Paramita is perfection. And of course, that's what this sutra is about. It is part of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And just know that there are a number of sutras in that category. In fact, there are three main ones besides the Heart Sutra that are much more extensive. This is actually a very short sutra compared to them. There's what's called the vast Prajnaparamita, which is in 100,000 stanzas. There's the intermediate Prajnaparamita, which is 25,000 stanzas. And then there's the brief, which is 8,000 stanzas. And the Heart Sutra contains the essence of all of them. That's why it's called the next word, Hridaya. Hridaya essentially means heart or essence. So this is the heart or the essence of all the Prajnaparamita, which is essentially the wisdom of the Buddha, the sacred mother, the prajna, the perfection of that prajna in the mind of a Buddha. And of course, sutra is simply the word that's used in Sanskrit to refer to a text or a discourse given by the Buddha. Now, it's interesting, in this one, we don't have the Buddha actually talking so much, right? I pointed out how we have those two parts, Shariputra asking a question, Avalokiteshvara answering the question, and then it's only at the end that the Buddha comes in and says a few words. So essentially, there are different types of speech that are within this sutra, that are within kind of many of the sutras. The very first one is what comes in our prologue and also comes at the end, which are the words that are there by the person who wrote the sutra down. It's said that Ananda, who was one of the Buddha's main disciples, is the one who recollected these teachings. And it's interesting, they actually weren't put down in writing for some centuries. But the Buddha, or the Ananda, through the blessing of his own mind, through his realizations, was able to retain all the words. And so they were written down eventually. But essentially, that is who is talking at the very beginning. Most of the sutras start with that phrase, right? Thus have I heard. And essentially, the I in there is Ananda. So that's the first type of speech of a Buddha, which is essentially the Buddha's speech that's given, he's given permission for Ananda, the scribe, to be able to start the sutra, to give the setting. We're going to go into that in a moment, to kind of indicate, what all is the sutra is about in terms of who's there, who's present, what have you. Then we also have words that the Buddha actually says, which of course in many sutras are the main part of the sutra. In this sutra, as I said, it's just a few words at the end. But this is also obviously a very important part of the Buddha's speech. A third type of the Buddha's speech is where he gives his blessings for others to speak for him, in a sense. And this is what he does with Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara, and we'll come to that shortly tonight as well, talking about how they get into a dialogue through the power of the Buddha, through the power of the Buddha giving his blessing to these two beings. So before we go on, I also want to talk about, I talked a little bit about Prajnaparamita already, but there are 4 categories. I know you're getting all these lists, numbers, but this is what happens in Buddhism many times, right? So we have 4 categories of the Prajnaparamita. The first one is the main one that is the actual Prajnaparamita, which is kind of what was being referred to in that title of Arya Bhagavati. It's the exalted wisdom of a Buddha that is, the omniscient mind of a Buddha that realizes emptiness all the time. Again, that is the perfected mind. Until we attain Buddhahood, we don't have that perfected wisdom. We have a practice of the perfection of wisdom, but it's only when we attain Buddhahood that we have the full resultant perfection of wisdom. That resultant perfection of wisdom is the actual Prajnaparamita. Nonetheless, we can talk about the path perfection of wisdom, which is what we need in order to eventually achieve the resultant perfection of wisdom. So when you're a bodhisattva practicing the perfection of wisdom, when you attain your direct realization of emptiness, it begins the process of creating the result of Buddhahood. Of course, it began even before then, but I'm just saying in particular, when we talk about your practice of the perfection of wisdom, that is part of creating the result of your attainment of Buddhahood. So we can talk about that as the second category of the perfection of wisdom. The first is the resultant perfection of wisdom, the fully realized mind of a Buddha. The second is the path perfection of wisdom, which is the realizations of emptiness in the mind of a bodhisattva. in the mind of a being who has not yet become a Buddha. A third way we can talk about the perfection of wisdom, the prajnaparamita, is the textual perfection of wisdom, which are the scriptures that we're studying, such as the Heart Sutra that we're studying, and the ones I mentioned earlier, 100,000 stanzas, 25,000 stanzas, and so on. There are many, the Vajracutter Sutra, which some of you may have studied. This also is in the Prajnaparamita. So it's not an actual perfection of wisdom because it's written words. It's actually the words of the Buddha and other disciples, such as Avalokiteshvara, that are describing the perfection of wisdom. So it's not an actual perfection of wisdom in terms of it being a realization, but it is nonetheless pointing the direction, giving us the teachings that help us to realize that, okay? The speech that the Buddha gave, the texts that explain them, are all included in that category, the scriptural or textual perfection of wisdom. The last one is kind of an interesting one. It's called the natural perfection of wisdom. What's the natural perfection of wisdom? The emptiness of all phenomena. And the Buddha taught that everything that exists, whether it's myself, anything in our world, chairs, tables, apples, trees, whatever it is, all phenomena, even emptiness itself, all of them are naturally empty of inherent existence. So this too is also not the perfection of wisdom. It's the object realized by the perfection of wisdom, right? It is the emptiness that we realize through our minds when we're on the path perfection of wisdom, as well as when we become a Buddha in that resultant perfection of wisdom. And it is, of course, what is taught by the scriptural perfection of wisdom, is the emptiness of all phenomena. So again, those four categories: resultant, path, scriptural, and natural perfection of wisdom. Why I'm bringing them up is because we will talk about some of them a little bit later when we get into the path, the actual stages that the Bodhisattva goes through in order to achieve Buddhahood. So I think that's all that I wanted to say on the title. Let's go to the prologue. Let me pull that up on the screen again so we can have that in front of us. The very first part of the prologue, again, is the common prologue. And let me go ahead and read what we have here. It can be read in the Portuguese. Thus did I hear at one time, the Bhagawan was dwelling on massive Vulture's Mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. They often talk about the common prologue, highlighting what are called 5 excellences, that there are 5 things that are entailed in here. Some of the commentaries only say 4, but Geshe Dakpa, one of our Geshes in San Francisco, California, he says that there is a 5th excellence that is also part of this 5 excellences. So the very first one is in that first sentence, thus did I hear at one time. This is the excellent time. It's kind of pointing to the fact that the Ananda, again, who's the scribe, is about to put down some words that refer to a particular time when the Buddha gave this teaching. Of course, again, the Buddha is not saying so much. It's mostly Avalokiteshvara, but it's through the power of the Buddha's blessings that those words are said. The idea that he heard those words at one time is referring to the fact that this is one time that he was present and he didn't hear it from a third person. Yeah, Ananda was there in the audience. And so the fact that it says that it's at one time or once is referring to the fact that kind of all of this came together for a particular, on a particular occasion for these teachings to be given. So it indicates that he was able to be there, hear it at this very particular time, and is now able to share these teachings with us. So that's called the excellent time. The second thing is called the excellent teacher, which is the Bhagawan, the Buddha. So it's saying again that the Bhagawan, the Buddha, this excellent teacher, was there at this excellent place. That's the third excellent. It says the Vulture's Mountain, or here it's called Massive Vulture's Mountain, sometimes called Vulture's Peak. I want to share with you, some of you may have been to India. I have not had the good fortune of going to India myself to do pilgrimage, but I wanted to kind of show you what Vulture's Peak looks like today. So let me go ahead and enlarge this a little bit. This is actually the peak from up above, and you'll see that there's like a little structure about in the center, Rajagriha. So again, let me go down one slide. That's that little enclosed area. So it's kind of interesting. They say there were like 1,250 monks and bodhisattvas there, or whatever, but you wonder how would they all fit up there. But nonetheless, there's said to be these kind of magical occurrences that happen when the Buddha teaches. So it may not be physically possible by our standard, but when a Buddha is teaching, there's all sorts of things that become possible. But this is the space in which many people go up to have pilgrimage to recall the Buddha teaching that. Okay, so this is an excellent place. This is where the Buddha gave the second wheel turning. This is where all of the teachings of the second wheel turning were given by the Buddha, were disseminated by the Buddha. So very auspicious place. Then let's go on to back to the sutra, and we'll look at the third excellence. The third excellence is the excellent retinue. Whoops, I'm sorry, that's not what I wanted to put up. I had it on the other one, but I just hit share. So let me click on the right one. There we go. We go back to the sutra and we see it says there, he's with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. So as I said, it's said to be like 1,250 monks. And by monks here, we don't just mean an ordinary monk, but also what's called an arhat. An arhat is a being who has attained their own liberation. So they're not really needing these teachings on emptiness because they've achieved that state, but nonetheless, they are in the audience kind of validating these teachings by being there. Geshe Dakpa says it's actually 1,249 arhats and Ananda, because Ananda actually did not achieve the state of arhatship while the Buddha was alive and teaching. He attained it later. But nonetheless, it's that great community of monks. By monks, we generally in the sutras refer to those of the Hinayana lineage, the lineage of the individual vehicle, those who strive for only their own liberation. So they are present, and many of them, again, with this great realizations, the majority of them having attained the state of liberation, but still embodied in this form and hearing these amazing teachings. Then it says a great community of bodhisattvas. And of course, this is indicating that this is a Mahayana sutra, that the main audience for this is those who aspire to become a Buddha. And these great bodhisattvas are aspiring to do so and listening to these teachings, and again, validating these teachings through their presence there. Now, I could say a lot more about what makes these bodhisattvas great, but obviously they are great-minded ones. They are the ones who are taking on the welfare of all sentient beings in the way that we are aspiring to do in our own path by generating bodhicitta and so on. In the more detailed commentaries, it talks about 6 greatnesses that they are imbued with, and I'll just mention them. I don't want to go into too deep of an explanation. They're greatly generous. They give greatly. Greatly intelligent. They have that sharp wisdom. They're greatly powerful. They're greatly engaged in Mahayana practices. So they have this great engagement and enthusiasm for the Mahayana. They're greatly armored with patience and enthusiastic effort. And then lastly, they're great tamers of all destructive forces. They can tame whatever destructive forces come their way. So again, we're talking about pretty elevated beings who were present at these Prajnaparamita sutras, on these beings who were following this bodhisattva path. Of course, one of the main ones is Avalokiteshvara. Now, before we get into that part of the prologue, I want to talk about this 5th excellence that is added on that isn't there explicit in the common prologue, and that's the subject matter of this sutra, which of course has great excellence. These are the teachings on emptiness that the Buddha is giving through the words of Avalokiteshvara, trying to help us to discern this profound truth. But it's said that, again, that is the explicit meaning. I alluded to this a little earlier tonight. In the Prajnaparamita, the main topic is emptiness. In that second wheel turning, he is primarily trying to get all those who hear the sutras, especially the Heart Sutra, to understand emptiness at the deepest level, to go to that really profound wisdom so that we can accomplish Buddhahood moreover than, our own liberation. Okay. But implicit within these teachings are the stages of development. And I'll get into those when we get into the actual commentary from Avalokiteshvara. But there are said to be these 5 paths of development that are kind of a progression of the bodhisattva's mind through various stages of development until they attain the 5th one, which is Buddhahood. So we'll go into this shortly. But this excellent topic of the sutra, that is the 5th excellence, is referring to both of those. Not just the teachings on emptiness, but the fact that the Buddha was also implicitly, in a hidden way, giving these teachings on how to progress on the bodhisattva path. So it's really quite amazing when you have that understanding. And again, it's all detailed on the outline that we're working with. Let's go ahead and talk about the uncommon prologue. That is what is unique to this sutra and what was going on in particular at this time. So, as it says there, I'll read this in the English. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. So we see there's 2 parts to this. And this is kind of, again, setting the stage for what is uniquely happening at this time. What is going on that we need to be particularly paying attention to. First of all, the Buddha Bhagawan, right? The fact that the Buddha Bhagawan was there present, but he was showing this aspect of being absorbed in this deep concentration. Again, it's called here profound perception. Essentially, what it's referring to is that at that time, the Bhagawan was completely immersed within the view of emptiness, entirely within that concentrative absorption and not stirring from that. Let me talk a little bit about what the state of Buddhahood is so we gain an understanding of that to some degree. When you attain Buddhahood, you do have a mind that is always in that state of knowing emptiness. It has developed this profound level of concentration so that you're never parted from that view of emptiness. Unlike when you're a bodhisattva, where you only go into meditation on occasion and you realize it, and then you come back out of meditation. And you have that realization there in your mind, but it's not present in a manifest way. Instead, for the Buddha, once you get to Buddhahood, you're always in that state of knowing emptiness. So even though it's described here as the Buddha being in that state, the Buddha's always in that state. The Buddha still can interact with beings, still can have dialogues and converse with beings, because that's what Buddhas do. That's how they help sentient beings. But for the mind of a Buddha, they never are parted from that realization of emptiness. At the same time, because they also have the other aspect of wisdom, they also know all conventional things. So they can know the minds of Buddhas, know how to produce words that will be a benefit to Buddhas, exactly where that person needs to be, what they need to hear, or what will help them the most. So you have kind of both aspects to a Buddha. A Buddha is always in meditation on emptiness, but also knowing how to benefit others and working in the world in a form that will help them. So even though there's this idea of the Buddha showing that aspect, it doesn't mean that he's not in perfect meditation on emptiness all the rest of the time. He's just in this state. And it's particularly through this state that he then provides the blessing for Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara to have this dialogue. But before we get to that, let's look at the other part of the uncommon prologue. This is pertaining to Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara is the Buddha of compassion. Now again, he was one of those main bodhisattvas that was in the retinue of the Buddha. It's actually said that he was a Buddha appearing as a bodhisattva. We have a lot of this kind of appearances in this sutra that are maybe hard for us to understand, but because the Mahayana path is a difficult one, we need examples of that. And there were said to be 8 main disciples, Bodhisattva disciples of the Buddha, that were actually Buddhas themselves that appeared in the form of a perfect Bodhisattva to make sure that anyone who is inclined to the Mahayana knows exactly how to practice, all right? So again, at that time, this Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Bodhisattva indicates that he's of the Mahayana lineage and practicing the Mahayana path. Mahasattva realizes that he has this profound wisdom already in his mind. Also, the word Arya indicates that, because again, an Arya is a being who has that exalted wisdom of emptiness. So this being, Avalokiteshvara, this compassionate being who is, they say this, the name of Avalokiteshvara means he who looks upon the world with eyes of compassion. And so this is a being who embodies that kind of compassion of the Buddhas, but he's not separated from the wisdom in this situation here, because he's contemplating this profound perception or perfection of wisdom in terms of seeing that his 5 aggregates are also empty of inherent nature, meaning also in addition to every other phenomenon. So I do want to talk a little bit about these 5 aggregates that this Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara is observing. So when we talk about the person, the I, we can talk about the 5 aggregates that are the basis for a person. The 5 aggregates can also be used as a way to encompass everything in our world that is condition, that arises from causes. But let's just bring it down to the 5 elements that are a part of the basis for a person. And the Buddha chose these for a particular reason, because they do have some importance. Oftentimes when we talk about the basis for a person, we simply say mind and body, right? Or mind-body complex. We use this in English sometimes. It means the collection of mind and body. Well, the aggregates are another way of looking at the collection of mind and body. The first aggregate is the body, and it is the aggregate of form. And as we're going to see, and as you know from having read the sutra before, form is the first one that the Buddha, or that Avalokiteshvara, starts working with to say that form is empty and so on. Form is that aggregate, that physical part of our being, right? It refers to the entirety of our body, everything we have that is physical. The other 4 aggregates are all within the context of mind. They are mental aggregates. By the word aggregate, this kind of means like a collection or a heap is sometimes the translation for the Sanskrit word skanda. Skanda means this collection or heap of stuff. So we have one heap of stuff that is our body, all the form, the material elements of our body or of our being. And then we have 4 that are mental heaps, mental collections of things. Let's go to the 5th aggregate first. The 5th aggregate is called the aggregate of consciousness. You might think that that includes all of mind, but in this context, it's referring to the 5 sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. Most of you know we have these 6 consciousnesses. Those are the means through which the mind knows. Remember that the mind is that which is clear and knowing. It is knowing phenomena, the external phenomena through the 5 senses, our eye consciousness, our ear, nose, tongue, body consciousness. Those are the main doorways through which we interact with the external world. And then we have mental consciousness. And for most of us, our mental consciousness is primarily conceptual mind. It's our mind that thinks, our mind that observes the world around us and categorizes things and, puts values on things and gets involved in samsara through false ideas and so on. Our mental consciousness is the main workshop in Buddhist terms. But all 6 of those consciousnesses are included in the 5th aggregate of consciousness. But we're just talking about those main minds, those main consciousnesses that are simply knowing. They're not involved with what are called the mental factors yet. This is alluding to another basic program course that we have that's called Minds and Mental Factors. Minds are kind of the big bucket in which everything is happening. These 6 consciousnesses, the 5 sense and the 1 mental. All of this is the big bucket in which things are happening. But then we can pick apart particular elements of our kind of mental horizon, things that are going on, different functions. Those are what are called the mental factors. It's just a way that we can conceptually divide up what's going on in our minds to gain a deeper appreciation for the role that our minds play in creating our problems as well as creating the solutions to our problems. So let's look at the three that are in the middle, the aggregate of feeling, discrimination, and what are called compositional factors. There are 51 mental factors in the traditional presentation of these mental factors in our texts, and 49 of them are in this category of compositional factors. The other two are feeling and discrimination. So within mental factors, we have different categories of things, but this includes kind of the way the Buddha isolated out some of our more positive states of mind, like faith and non-harmfulness and so on, as well as some of our more non-virtuous states of mind, the things that get us in trouble, like our hatred and our desire and so on, all of these deluded minds. Those are some of the categories. We also have states of mind that are present all the time, what are called omnipresent mental factors. And two of those are feeling and discrimination. We also have a number of other categories. Again, I'm not going to go into all of those in detail. But essentially this fourth aggregate, the aggregate of compositional factors, includes the other 49. Feeling and discrimination are two of our mental factors that are always present. Now, why did the Buddha choose those two? When he starts talking about the basis for a person, why didn't he just say body and mind and just lump those all together and just say there are two aggregates? We have an aggregate of form and an aggregate of mind and just leave it at that. Well, because he wanted to highlight the role that these mental factors play, and particularly the two, feeling and discrimination. So feeling is referring not to our whole range of feelings or emotions. It's referring to what I like to call a feeling tone. And by a tone, we just mean something that is registering in our mental landscape whenever we encounter an object, which is all the time. Even in our subtler states, there's generally some object, that's manifesting. But whenever we encounter an object, there's one of three different feeling tones. Either that object is pleasant and it's inducing that pleasant feeling tone because it's pleasant for us, or it's unpleasant for us, which induces an unpleasant feeling tone, or it's neutral. And so it produces a kind of flat line, a neutral tone. Throughout every moment of your day, some level of feeling is arising. Either you're experiencing something pleasant that induces that pleasant tone, something unpleasant, again, induces its tone, and then, of course, neutral. And it's good to pay attention to this because the Buddha says this is how we actually get in a lot of trouble, is because we follow after those things that are pleasant and grab at them through the mind of attachment and desire, right? We also have a lot of anger and aversion towards what is unpleasant, pushing it out of our lives, wanting to do everything to get rid of those things. And then, we engage in negative actions often on the basis of either of those. But with the neutral the neutral feeling tones, we tend to kind of zone out. We don't really have a sharp, cutting mind at those times. And we just sort of don't do anything. We just hang out with that neutral feeling, that neutral tone. So these three are how we get involved in so many of our difficulties and problems. The Buddha also did highlight that these are the three, the feeling tones are what lay practitioners need to pay attention to mostly, but I would say everyone needs to pay attention to them. But for those who are still engaged in the world, we see how much we get caught up in all of that, right? Oh, what's pleasant, what's unpleasant, what have you. We go back and forth. Our mind gets like a yo-yo, goes up and down because we're strongly attached to getting what's pleasant and we don't want to have what is unpleasant. Discrimination is highlighted by the Buddha because it's actually said to be how monastics get into their difficulties much more. Hopefully monastics have the opportunity to remove themselves from the world, but they start engaging in their views and defending their views to others. And when the discrimination factor, which is essentially saying this is this, that is that, when you're able to discriminate certain things, you start creating conflict with others because you start discriminating what you see as good and right and correct and what other people see as wrong and what have you. Again, I would say everybody does that to some degree too, but the Buddha highlighted these for lays and monastics respectively, feeling and discrimination. But don't think that discrimination is purely conceptual. because discrimination is, again, playing a role even when our eye consciousness is operating, for example. We discriminate between the color yellow and the color blue, right? We can say, oh, there's two different colors here. Our eye consciousness doesn't know the label for them, but our eye consciousness can discriminate those two different shades of color. All right. So discrimination is what allows you to differentiate between this and that through any of your consciousnesses. Feeling is the continual feeling tone that we have all the time. So again, I'm just introducing you to those because it is important to have some understanding of them. They're brought up in the Buddhist sutras many, many times. We're going to see them coming into play very shortly when we get into the actual dialogue of Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara. So again, we have in the uncommon prologue at this time, the Bhagawan, the Buddha, is it showing the aspect of being in this deep meditative concentration on emptiness. Even Avalokiteshvara, this bodhisattva, is showing the aspect of having this meditation on the aggregates being empty of inherent existence, seeing the selflessness of phenomena. Remember how I talked about those two selflessnesses earlier tonight? He's already seen the selflessness of persons, but now in most of this sutra, he's engaging in the selflessness of phenomena, coming to see that the basis for a person is lacking any inherent existence. We're going to see that when he begins his explanation, because he says something similar, meaning that he's now not only seeing the emptiness of the I, this self, this person, but he's also seeing the emptiness of the basis for the person, and of course of everything else that exists. Because as I said earlier, in the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom, everything is empty of inherent existence. Everything lacks that way of existing. So this is setting the stage. These two parts of the prologue give us an idea of where we are, this excellent time and place with an excellent retinue and an excellent teacher of the Buddha being present, and then this excellent teaching that's going to be given. And on that occasion, this uncommon prologue, where the Buddha is showing this aspect of being in this deep meditation, and Avalokiteshvara is coming to this realization that the aggregates are empty of inherent nature. Now we get into the actual sutra, which is going to take up the rest of tonight, of course, and next week we'll continue, or 2 weeks from tonight, we'll continue with that. First of all, I do want to talk just briefly about Shariputra. Shariputra, I mean, he's a bit of kind of like a stand-in for just creating this question, just to come forward with all of this. There are some texts that say that Shariputra also was kind of an emanation of a highly realized being. But Shariputra, in some degree, does tend to represent the Hinayana. So I just want to maybe take it back to off screen, because I want to talk about the Hinayana and the Mahayana and what are called the three vehicles. This maybe should have been a preliminary topic earlier, but there are two practitioners of the Hinayana in terms of the types. One of them is called the hearers. The hearers are those who hear the Mahayana but don't necessarily practice it, but yet they will teach it to others. Instead, once more, they practice a path to their own liberation. So the Hinayana path, we often call it the individual vehicle or the fundamental vehicle. It's what the Buddha taught initially. And all of what's come to be known as the Pali Canon supports primarily this practice of the hearer path, the ability for individuals to attain their own freedom from suffering. And a wonderful accomplishment that the Buddha taught the means to attain. The second type of Hinayana practitioner is called a solitary realizer. Solitary realizers do partake of teachings from teachers while they are in the learning mode, but in their final lifetime, they decide they want to be reborn in a place where there are no teachers, so they can achieve their own freedom from samsara, their own liberation, completely alone, completely by themselves. That's why they're called solitary, because in their final lifetime, they want to show that accomplishment. And it's said that they do then go on to teach others in that world, because there are no Buddhas in that world. There are no teachers in that world. So they do have some compassion and a desire to teach. But both of them are not aspiring to become a Buddha. They are only aspiring to achieve their own liberation. So it is said that Shariputra actually was in that, showing that aspect of being one of these hearers, one of these practitioners. And so you'll notice that even in the way he asks the question, he's asking it from a slightly kind of perspective of, this being a much more profound way to go about practicing wisdom. What's being talked about here, kind of saying, I don't really know. Can you tell me, Avalokiteshvara, how do we actually practice this? Because he's not in that path. He's following the path that would lead to being an arhat. Because both the hearer and the solitary realizer, they both attain this state of arhat. We sometimes translate that as foe destroyer, meaning that they have destroyed the foe that are the afflictions that keep them bound up in this state of samsara, going from life to life. Whereas the bodhisattvas who are practicing the Mahayana, they want to remove everything that obscures the mind so they can attain Buddhahood. They don't achieve just their own liberation. So I just want to give that little bit of context so we understand a bit of where this question is coming from. So let me go ahead and read that part, how Shariputra asked his question. It says, then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? So one of the things that's kind of within the Hinayana to some degree, though I think even some of the Mahayana teachings might say this, though it's not correct, is this idea that you have to have a male body to be able to practice this deeper wisdom. Because he only asks about a son of the lineage, right? Well, you're going to see Avalokiteshvara responds and says, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage. So there is this kind of misunderstanding that goes on sometimes, thinking that somehow this is a path for those of the male gender, but this is not true. In the Mahayana, we're all able to practice this equally. So this is how, again, Shariputra is framing this question to some degree, thinking that he's coming from a bit more of that perspective of the Hinayana. All right. So it says there through the power of Buddha, because remember, this is the Buddha's speech that is being generated through his blessings. It's like this confluence of things comes together. The Buddha is there, Shariputra is there, Avalokiteshvara is there, all these other beings surrounding, watching in the retinue. And everything has come to this perfect moment where the Buddha's power allows Shariputra to come forward and ask this question, and then for Avalokiteshvara to give this great response. So let's look at the very first part of the response from Avalokiteshvara. He says, he said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly, beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. So this is where, again, we have those statements being made by Avalokiteshvara that it's for anyone of whatever gender to be able to practice this. It's not just those who are born male. And they can do that by coming to see that it's not only the I, the person, that is empty of inherent existence, but also the five aggregates are empty of inherent nature. As I said, this is pointing to the fact of how we actually need to go about developing our own realizations. Maybe you've come across this in the lam-rim as well in your study, but they say that we begin with investigating this I. And as I said, there are coarser forms of selflessness taught in regard to the I that are good stepping stones. They are good things to realize to get to this very subtle view of emptiness. But this is how we should start, is looking at this I, this person that we are deeply involved with, right? This is the source of all of our problems. That's the primary reason why we start with the I, is because all of our difficulties revolve around the fact that we are misconceiving how we exist. On the basis of that, we then engage with the world in unhealthy ways. As I said, through the force of these feelings, we then have this inherent our inherently existing I that requires those things for our happiness and grasps at them and doesn't want to be separated from them. And then it also pushes away what is unpleasant, kind of setting all of that up so that we end up creating a lot of suffering for ourselves and others whenever we follow that mind. So essentially, we have this strong sense of a self that's at the center of all of this. Everything revolves around this strong sense of an I. So this is the main reason why we begin with investigating the selflessness of persons first, looking at ourselves as empty of inherent existence. And then we can look at other phenomena, the selflessness of phenomena. So a second reason, though, why we want to start with the I is because to some degree we can see that this sense of an I does depend upon mind and body, does depend upon aggregates being there, right? We don't think that there's an I here without there being the mind and body here. We don't think that someone else is in the room unless we see, well, their body. We can't see their mind, but their mind and body are in the room. And then we can say, oh, so-and-so is here. This person is here, that person. So there is already maybe a little bit of an ease, a little bit easier to realize the selflessness of the I, because we do see that it depends to some degree on the aggregates. Without the aggregates being there, we can't have the I there. So it is said to be a little bit easier to realize as well. But once more, whether we are looking at the I or whether we're looking at something other than the I, the emptiness is the same. We look at it and we are refuting that the I or that other phenomena exist inherently, intrinsically, objectively. Okay? So this is the sequence by which we actually need to realize emptiness, is begin with looking at the I. Now that's not described in the sutra, right? All it is it's implied with what Avalokiteshvara is saying here in that passage, where he says those five aggregates also as an empty of inherent nature. So it's not just the I that is imputed on the basis of this collection of stuff. It's also that collection of stuff, the five aggregates that are empty. And that actually is the sequence of realization. We first realize the emptiness of the I, and then we realize the emptiness of the five aggregates, as well as all these other things that exist. Because we're going to go through, again, the whole list of things when we get to the rest of the sutra next week. So this is the idea behind that introduction. Now, before we go on to the next part, I do want to introduce you to these five paths. And I don't know if I'll have much time beyond that. And then we'll hopefully have time for a question or two. Let's take a look at these five paths. And to do that, you may have been sent, I think you were sent all of these handouts that were translated into Portuguese, but there are probably two versions. One of them is from Nalanda Monastery. I think it's a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier to work with. So again, this has been translated as the five paths of the Mahayana five paths, okay? And so the idea behind it is that you work from the left to the right. So what happens is I'm talking about myself here. Maybe you're already a bodhisattva, but I'm not already a bodhisattva because I don't have uncontrived bodhicitta. You'll see that letter B there on this chart that's underneath the path of accumulation at the left side there. It says that you actually have to have effortless bodhicitta to enter the path. That has to be generated. Most of us are up to the left of that. We're still generating bodhicitta through the techniques we learn in the lam-rim. We're still trying to make that very firm in our mind. When it's combined with very deep concentration, you enter into the Mahayana path. You become a bodhisattva. You are not yet a bodhisattva until you have that mind stable. It still can degenerate a little for like the first level of the path of accumulation there, what is called the small path of accumulation. But once you get to the medium, then it will no longer degenerate. As it says there at point C, it's not possible then to fall to the Hinayana. You won't ever degenerate from the Mahayana. Anyway, on the path of accumulation, that first of the five paths, it's called that because you are accumulating your kind of meritorious karma, all the good actions you've been engaging in, together with bodhicitta. And then you are also accumulating your wisdom. Again, both aspects of the path, the two wings of the bird. So you need to accumulate both of those very strongly so that you then can eventually enter into the next path, the path of preparation. And you'll notice that for point D, when you do that, where you cross over from the path of accumulation to the path of preparation, you actually have to have here what's called a union of calm abiding and special insight, observing emptiness. Again, calm abiding is the perfection of concentration that the Bodhisattva develops. Special insight is their perfection of wisdom. So you do have to have some perfection of wisdom. That's a path perfection of wisdom. It's not a direct realization yet. It's still conceptual. It's observing emptiness. But it's based on your developing that deep understanding through analyzing for emptiness, using the techniques that are taught in the lam-rim. When you have that conceptual mind realizing emptiness with this force of meditation, you enter into the path of preparation. It is called that because you are preparing to enter into the path of seeing. You're preparing for your first direct realization of emptiness. By direct, we mean it's no longer the conceptual mind. It's actually a direct awareness that is non-conceptual. That's what happens when you get to point G there. At point G, you have the direct realization of emptiness and a generation of what's called ultimate bodhicitta, meaning that you no longer just have conventional bodhicitta, the mind that wishes to become a Buddha for the sake of others. It's now combined with a direct realization of emptiness, with a more ultimate state of mind. So let me talk just a moment, but take this off screen and we'll come back and talk about the next path. So again, what happens is as you develop, right now you're developing your wisdom of emptiness. As you listen to these teachings, anytime you attend to the teachings in the lam-rim about emptiness, anytime you meditate on emptiness, all of that is useful to precede your development of bodhicitta. Then you continue to accumulate more and more wisdom through doing more and more meditation on emptiness. And eventually you get to that point that we pointed out when you cross over into the path of preparation, when you have deep concentration, calm abiding, and an ability to see emptiness in a conceptual way. Again, it's already very profound, but it's not what we're aiming for in terms of a deeper achievement and a deeper change in our minds. To do that, we have to actually, the conceptual mind has to fall away. When you get to the path of seeing, it said through the path of preparation, this sense of the subjective mind and the object being known, emptiness, that this sense of separation becomes less and less and less. We have the feeling that there's not so much differentiation between subject and object. And eventually, when you get to a place where you realize emptiness directly, just before that, you have this, what's called the supreme mundane qualities, that level of the path of preparation. It's the highest level you can be at as an ordinary being, a mundane being, before you become an Arya, before you achieve a supramundane mind. So when you get to that point, you're ready for this direct realization where all this sense of subject and object completely falls away. They say that emptiness and the mind realizing emptiness become like water poured into water. You know, if you took 2 glasses of water and poured them together, right, you wouldn't be able to differentiate one glass of water from the other. They completely mingle, they are completely combined. Your realization of emptiness at this point becomes so profound that you no longer have this differentiation of subject and object. It's non-conceptual. Right now, we're realizing emptiness conceptually. We have an idea of emptiness that isn't exactly the taste of emptiness. You won't know the taste of emptiness till you get to this point. It's said to be quite profound. You won't mistake it for anything else because you go into this experience and you come out the other side completely changed. Okay, so the path of seeing isn't very long because it entails this initial direct realization plus the period in subsequent attainment when you are kind of going about your daily business, but once more, you don't have any conviction in things existing inherently. It said they appear that way, and they appear that way because we have these subtler obscurations in our minds that cause that false appearance. But you don't believe in them for a moment because you're convinced they don't exist inherently, because you've had that direct realization. So the path of seeing, Rinpoche calls it, Lama Zopa calls it the path of insight. This is said to be a very profound milestone in the Bodhisattva's path. I'll talk about these maybe the next time this little kind of herringbone thing here that's beginning of each of these sort of moving into the next ground. You'll notice that we're on the first ground here, and then we continue on all the way through the 10th ground. Most of the grounds are incorporated in what's called the path of meditation. The path of meditation is called that because you continually meditate on the emptiness of things, realizing, that emptiness at a deeper and deeper level, so that you continue to remove more and more of these obstructions. At point H, you remove what are called here the afflictive obstructions or obscurations. The afflictive obscurations are what keep you from being liberated. So for the Bodhisattva, they've attained the complete removal of that when they enter the 8th ground. But that's not their goal, right? They're not like those hearers and solitary realizers that just want to achieve their own liberation. They need to keep moving forward. They need to remove what are called the knowledge obscurations or cognitive obscurations. These are what keep you from being fully enlightened. Now, as it's described there, the afflictive obscurations are the conception of inherent existence along with the seeds of that, whereas the cognitive obscurations are the imprints of that conception of inherent existence and all factors of mistaken dualistic appearance that arise due to its force. So these are what actually keep you from becoming a Buddha, are these very subtle imprints in the mind that cause this dualistic appearance. Remember how I was talking about this differentiation of subject and object? When you're in meditative equipoise, meditation on emptiness, that all disappears. But when you come back out of it, when the meditation is done, there's subject and object again. There's this dualistic appearance. And things appear to you as if they are real, as if they exist from their own side, as if they have that intrinsic existence. This is due to the fact of these cognitive obscurations. These imprints on the mind cause this false appearance. As I said, the Bodhisattva doesn't believe in it for a moment, but they continue to have that false appearance. And this is what blocks you becoming omniscient, you becoming a Buddha. So the first level that the Bodhisattva removes, the Bodhisattva first removes the afflictive obscurations because they have to remove those first. Those are coarser. Then in the last 3 grounds, the 8th, 9th, and 10th grounds, what are called the pure grounds, they remove the knowledge obscurations, cognitive obscurations. Those are what cause them to finally cross over into what's called the path of no more learning. So we're going to see the Heart Sutra structured in terms of some of this instruction. This very last moment, there's not a letter down below it, the very last moment of a sentient being before you become a Buddha and you enter the path of no more learning is a very deep meditative concentration called the Vajra-like meditative stabilization. So all of these are indicated on our little outline of the path. Let's go back to that. Whoops, sorry, this one. So we'll see here that what we're going to get into when we come back in 2 weeks is the real heart of the sutra. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and so on. That starts our first 2 paths, as you see in the box on the right, the paths of accumulation and preparation. Then we have some teachings from Avalokiteshvara that pertain to the path of seeing. And then we have the path of meditation, and that's where we get into all of this. There's no form, no feeling, no discrimination, all these things that are negated as existing inherently. That continues all the way until we get to the path of no more learning. Again, but there's this final moment where we have the Vajra-like meditative stabilization that occurs just before, that's in that paragraph, that's the last part of the path of meditation. And then we enter into the path of no more learning, become a Buddha. And then there's some final, practice advice that Avalokiteshvara gives us and so on before we get into the mantra. So again, we won't have time to go into all of these teachings in great detail, but at least I'll give you an idea of kind of what each of them is saying. Because again, it's good to have some knowledge. I remember Lama Zopa Rinpoche and some teachings I had from him. He said it's really good to recite the Heart Sutra, obviously. It's very auspicious. But he says if you recite it while you're thinking about the meaning of it, then he says it's not just the dessert, like the pie or the cake or whatever. It's got the cream on top. It's got this kind of extra special power to it. So I hope that with tonight, and then of course next week when we look at more detail, the teachings on emptiness that are in this sutra, you can get the cream on top to be able to make this very useful in your recitation. Okay, so I want to end now, so see if there's any questions. We've got about 5 minutes, and you can, I guess, I don't know, how are those handled, Venerable Namdro?
Yeah, so I don't know if somebody already sent to Jan Pili to translate.
No, I didn't have any question here yet.
Okay, not yet.
So if you just write down on the chat, and then Jan is going to translate. I think Jani Verismo, I think you raise your hand, so maybe you can write down on the chat.
Can I make a question?
Please.
My own.
I think so. Yeah.
If there's no question.
Yeah, just make sure it gets translated to Portuguese. I think Bruno. Will Bruno hear you?
Yes, he's going to translate.
Okay.
Yes,
all
I'm
right,
going
good.
to. So when Avalokiteshvara starts to answer the question of Shariputra, he starts by showing the emptiness of the basis for the I, right?
Right.
So it is implicit that the I itself, the concept, the imputation is also empty? Or
yes.
How is
Again, it's what they say is that when he says in that line where he says that the repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature, in this case, the also means that not only has he seen the I to lack inherent existence, but he also now sees the basis for the I, as well as all other phenomena. Okay. That's the idea. So again, the I isn't mentioned in here. We don't say no I, capital I, no self. Instead, we go into no form and no feeling and no object of touch and all these various things. So the idea is Avalokiteshvara has already had that realization of the emptiness of the person, the I. Okay, yeah, we have another question here, but were there any from the chat box yet, or? No. Okay, Paula, please, if you can share in the Portuguese, I think, if you are more comfortable, and then it can be translated to me by Jean or Bruno, whoever. Jean.
Hi, hey everyone, good evening. So Don, thank you so much for your teachings. I just realized I never really had any explanation of what perception, the profound perception is, because at first I used to say profound perfection, and then I realized it's actually perception, and I don't actually know the difference. I mean, the difference in the word I know is different, and I know the meaning of the word, but when it comes to the Buddhist aspect of it, I don't know.
Yeah, let me give you, I'm going to read a little passage from a commentary by Geshe Gyaltsen, some teachings he gave on the Heart Sutra. So he says the word profound in profound perception refers to profound emptiness and appearance. So the Buddha is having this realization of emptiness, but as I said earlier, together with the appearance. Because a Buddha doesn't just know emptiness all the time. They also know the appearance of things. We're going to go into this a little bit next week or next time. The ultimate truth of emptiness and the conventional truth of appearances, of things that are existing in our world, form and feeling and, objects of touch and what have you, all the various things that we have, all right? Then he says perception here refers to the wisdom that perceives emptiness. Therefore, Buddha was involved in single-pointed concentration on the ultimate nature of reality, which was free from both coarse and subtle forms of laxity or drowsiness and excitement or distraction. So again, the idea is that this is just pointing to the Buddha being in this state of profound perception, where he's able to hold this awareness, particularly of emptiness all the time, but also together with the appearance of or the awareness of appearance, the awareness of conventional phenomena. You know, when we talk about, we just went through the path and we go all the way up to the 10th ground, and it's at that last moment of a sentient being, you generate this very deep meditation that removes these subtlest obscurations, the cognitive obscurations. That is actually what keeps you from knowing the two truths. It keeps you from knowing both the ultimate truth of the wisdom of emptiness, as well as the phenomena that are empty. Because these are always together. This is what we're going to do at the beginning of the next one. When we say form is empty, emptiness is form, we mean that essentially form manifests from its emptiness. Emptiness is the base for things manifesting as form. So these two are always together, but we're only able to see one or the other when we're a bodhisattva. We either go into meditation and we see ultimate truth, emptiness. We come out of meditation and we see conventional truth, how things appear. For the Buddha, they are able to hold both of these. So I think when we talk about this being a profound perception, it's a profound perception of emptiness, but it is together in the Buddha's mind with the awareness of all that exists, because a Buddha no longer has those obscurations. Okay, good. We have another question from
Don, I
William.
have a question
you have one. Okay.
from the
Yes.
chat before
Yeah.
William. Okay.
Oh, okay, let's go with
So
that.
the question
yes.
is, in which stage of the bodhisattva path is the need of achieving shamatha or calm abiding?
Okay,
Going to
that's
the
a good
10th
yeah.
stage.
Yeah, it's a good question. When we studied this in the master's program in Italy, it actually is ideal to have calm abiding even before you enter the path. In other words, if you generate that initial moment of a bodhisattva, remember when I could put it back on the chart, but you have to have what's called spontaneous bodhicitta, uncontrived bodhicitta. In order for you to have that, you need a very stable mind. So for most realizations of the path to enlightenment of lam-rim, we need to have something like calm abiding or the actual calm abiding. In our teachings at the master's program, they said that it can be close to that. Most of you have studied the lam-rim teachings on calm abiding. You know that there are 9 levels. I think it's the 8th level is called equipoise, and then the 9th is, I can't remember it right now, but essentially it's the 8th or the 9th would probably be good enough as a basis for developing this mind of bodhicitta that makes you a bodhisattva, that enters the path of accumulation. But if you don't have something approaching that, you can't have that stable bodhicitta. It just won't be that stable in your mind. So if you don't have calm abiding there, you definitely have to have calm abiding somewhere on the path of accumulation, so you can then use it as a basis for the special insight that knows emptiness conceptually, that is the doorway to the next path, the path of preparation. Okay, so calm abiding is best done even before entering the path, so you have a strong basis for all of your lam-rim meditations and realizations. But it has to be there, especially once you get to the path of preparation, but even would be highly advised for entering the path of accumulation, becoming a bodhisattva, okay, or something close to it again. All right. All right, and then to William. Yeah. William, please unmute. Oh, can't do. There you go.
Okay, now okay, thank you. Good night, everyone. Don, you said regarding the aggregates, it was very nice, the understanding of the feeling as a feeling tone. So it's easier to understand. And you talk that there are 3 types of feeling tones: the pleasant, the unpleasant, and the neutral. And that the Buddha said, these are the source of our troubles. Okay, that's clear. But it's easy to understand that the pleasant and the unpleasant, yes, they are source of troubles. But what about the neutral one?
Yeah. Again, it is part of causing our problems, because when we have a neutral feeling tone, we kind of perpetuate our ignorance, because we don't generally do anything with that. We just sort of the mind gets dull, the mind gets heavy. It doesn't mean, I would say some parts of our day are definitely neutral, right? Most of us have some portion of our day where nothing much is happening. Maybe we're not really experiencing anything that pleasant and nothing unpleasant is happening. And so we just sort of, we use this phrase in English, you kind of zone out. The mind doesn't really actively engage in anything. So it kind of perpetuates our ignorance. It doesn't allow anything, any counterforce to our ignorance. So I can't say that it becomes very active, it's more passive, but it does definitely create the space for the mind to not be that discerning, for that, for anything to happen, because we often fall prey to those sorts of neutral states and just hang out in them. We don't do anything other than kind of being in them. So it doesn't play as active a role as the pleasant and the unpleasant. Yes, the pleasant do induce more attachment, and the unpleasant a lot of aversion or anger. But nonetheless, the neutral tones also do just cause us to get very dull. We don't do anything then to question things, to investigate things, and we just keep our ignorance going. That's the way it's generally explained. But as I said, it's not as active as the other two, perhaps. Okay. Does that make some sense? Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other from the chat box? No? Okay, good. So let's do just a little mental dedication. We won't recite any prayers. I like to do this just in our minds. Let's think about this last hour and a half, this 90 minutes that we've spent together, and all the thoughts that we've had, all words we've said or heard, all the things that we've engaged in with this wonderful Heart Sutra. May all of what we've created, this positive energy, bring forth the best possible result for both ourselves and others. Through our own attainment of Buddhahood, may we be able to benefit all sentient beings perfectly. And we also dedicate for the good health and long lives of our precious teachers, who are very much involved in our path to enlightenment. We need them as a source and support on our spiritual path. So we think about His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We think about Kyabji Zopa Rinpoche, Lama Zopa. We think about all the other teachers that we and others have in their lives. And we make strong prayers for the good health and long lives of all these precious teachers, so that we and others may always have perfect guides in all of our lifetimes. And lastly, I like to have people dedicate in their own hearts for those beings whose suffering moves you right now. Maybe you have friends, family members, people close to you who are in difficult situations, having obstacles, being ill, perhaps dying, or maybe they've died recently. Or maybe there are people in certain parts of the world or in your community at large that are experiencing some suffering who you don't know so well, but you nonetheless want to think about them. All those beings who we're holding in our heart right now, let's think about sending them this positive energy. And this is like that practice of Tonglen, developing bodhicitta, right? We're going to give away all that we have so others can experience the benefit. And think that it becomes everything that they need to free them from suffering, to help them to have all the realizations of the path, to be able to practice the path perfectly. And may this also happen for all beings through what we have done here tonight. So wonderful. So I will be back with you again in 2 weeks, and be in a different setting because I'll be at my mom's house. So I'll be teaching from there, but I'll look forward to seeing you then. And again, I hope to see some of you in the karma teachings as well. Karma is such an interesting topic and such a complex topic. It's always good to kind of go back to teachings on it to remind ourselves of the importance of it. So, but I look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. Stay safe, everyone, and be well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dawn. Thank
Very
you.
welcome. Thanks, Venerable Nona. Thank you, Bruno, for translating, and Jean for your help with the questions. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you
Very
so
welcome.
much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
Thank
Dawn.
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Então, pessoal,